Hello, welcome. I'm delighted to greet you today from the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director of the Center for Positive Organizations, and I am thrilled to introduce today's conversation with Antoinette Weibel, where we will have a chance to talk about the elephant in the room, as Antoinette says, the question of positive for whom and positive to what effect. A few notes before we begin on the technology that we will use today. You'll notice that the chat and Q&A panels are turned off. We invite you to turn off other tabs and other notifications and really sit back and offer yourself the opportunity to listen to this fascinating conversation with Antoinette. We have enabled live transcription services for the event, and you can turn them on or off on your Zoom setting toolbar. We are recording the event, and the video will be shared with you in the coming days. We have some sponsors that we would like to deeply thank for their support of the Positive Links speaker series: the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Sanger Leadership Center, and the Zell-Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies have been our sponsors for the 23-24 Positive Links speaker series. We're so grateful. We also have partners who help us get the word out. We'd like to thank Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management for their help in promoting this speaker series this year. If you and your organization would like to be a promotional partner and help us share the word, please reach out and let us know. And on that note, we are delighted to have the chance to share these speaker sessions with you. We try to bring you leading scholars in the field who offer inspiring, practical, evidence-based strategies to help you and your organization do good in the world and thrive, although we're going to test those questions today about what we mean by all of that. But we want to continue to bring you these speaker series freely and openly available and keep the series growing. So if you're a friend of our work and you could consider supporting us, any amount would be gratefully received. And now to the thrill that I have to welcome my colleague and someone who I would audaciously hope to call my friend, Antoinette Weibel. She is a chaired professor for human resource management at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and also the director of the Institute for Work and Employment Research, as well as on the executive committee for the Institute of Business Ethics at the University of St. Gallen. Antoinette very graciously hosted me on a visit to the University of St. Gallen and invited us at the Center for Positive Organizations to teach a class that we teach here in the US to the students in her university. And that was one of the ways that I've been moved by Antoinette's work, but mostly I've been moved by reading her work and following her as a scholar. She's one of the most renowned people in the world studying the topic of trust. But today we're actually going to talk about Antoinette's passion project. Well, we probably will touch on trust, but we're going to also dive into work that she's doing in the Good Organizations Project, where one of the ways she explains this passion is by saying that she seeks to get academia listening again, so that good organizations are creating good society and vice versa. Antoinette, thank you for joining me in this conversation. I'm thrilled, delighted, whatever other words like that I could choose. Welcome.
And I'm so happy to be here. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Monica. I'm really looking forward.
Well, I wanted to start because many of our listeners and viewers don't know you and haven't had the chance to spend time with you as I have a little bit. So, could you share a little bit about how you would tell your journey as a scholar and what brought you to talking with me today?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I guess I am something like a cousin to positive organizational scholarship, but we never really are in the same fraction, so to say, because what I have been doing for 30 years probably now is I looked at intrinsic motivation and I looked at trust. So these were my big two topics. And because I am a trained economist, I always looked at these topics in regards to in organizations, between organizations, and what organizations do with these two positive states. And just to name a little bit, to make that maybe a little bit more juicy. So I was one of those who looked at the crowding out, as we call it, the undermining of intrinsic motivation. So we did a lot of studies on that. Nobody really wanted to listen to that, but it was really very real in our studies. We also looked at other things like competitive HR practices and how this produces envy, and that we also believe envy is not a very good motivator and leads to all kind of negative states. Well, that doesn't sound like I'm a positive state researcher. So we
Right.
also looked at, and then I don't want to bring everything, but just to give you a little bit of the background, trust and control is another important aspect. And here, our newest project is, for instance, we look at datafication technologies. So think Amazon warehouse, how they measure people, how you have even maybe algorithms telling you that you have to leave your job again. And we were asking, is it possible with these technologies to have trust still? And how would these technologies and the deployment of these technologies look like? So this is, I mean, you can already see it's quite broad, but I was always interested to keep the positive and understand how character of organizations would have to be changed in order to that we can lighten up the positive rather than diminish it as we do so often.
Yes. So I said we weren't going to talk about trust, but we just have to pause there for a moment because it's too important to pass right by too fast. So, tell us a little bit more about just your high level summary of crowding out of intrinsic motivation. I mean, it's something that's so important that I don't think we're talking about enough.
Well, I mean, this is very old research, and I guess most of you will know self-determination theory because it's very central also, of course, to some of the things that positive organizational scholars are doing. So we were basically like Desai and Ryan also looking what is happening if we work with performance contingent rewards. If you do this, then you get that. That's at least how Dan Pink puts it
Right.
in his brilliant
Right.
video. And I mean, that's was very helpful video because now people start to believe it. And we were doing meta-analysis. We were also doing vignette studies and our own experiments and trying to find out, can we show what is happening? How does it relate to performance, but also how does it relate to motivation? And we were in our studies, at least, it always came out that it makes you think about the money and forget about the joy of your job. So this is, I think, psychologically the undermining effect. But we also found in a number of studies that it diminishes performance. And I think that maybe is a little bit more exciting for most out there. I will tell you later why I believe that's maybe not the only thing to look at here. But still, I mean, hard cash, it's very problematic because it undermines not only task performance in certain instances, but more importantly, also organizational citizenship behavior. And even more so, um, it makes people not thinking clearly. Or as Mats Alvesen called it, it creates functional stupidity because, of course, you're not going to tell somebody who is defining your pay, your incentives, that something is going wrong. But I mean, that we can go quite a bit still.
Yes. Right.
So,
Right.
but that in a nutshell, that's
But
the
that,
crowding out effect and the multiple tasking effect, as the economists call it.
yes. And so that's a jumping off point from, as you characterize it, a long time ago in your work.
Yeah, yeah.
But as you think about what you're doing in the area of trust research or thinking about trust now, what's interesting you most about the topic or the work in this moment?
Well, I think I did a whole journey here as well. I mean, I think I must be honest, I find trust sympathetic. So it's really something I believe is very, it's worthy, it's important. We need that in our lives. So of course, a lot of my research was also about why would that be important? When is it important? What does it help us and is enabling us to do? So that was really most of what I did before. And as I said, again, in organizations and looking at especially also HR practices, how that impacts on trust. But recently we turned a little bit more to moral trust, especially in this context of these datafication technologies where there is the threat that people are being very much surveyed, that they are not having any privacy left, that they are also kind of then more at the mercy of their employer. And if I put it this way, you might already see why that also has a normative component. Because if somebody is at your mercy, there, at least in ethics, you would say you have a duty to care. And that is one reason why we could talk about trust and say, in this instance, the company needs to trust you more. They still
Right.
need to leave you some latitude. That's the important
Yeah.
part here. And so, for instance, just this is already a certain switch I've been doing by not looking so much at it pays, but really, no, you have the duty to trust your employees as
Mm,
well and to make sure that they still can grow and flourish to some degree.
yeah. So that brings us very nicely to the title of today's talk, which we want we wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. So
Yeah.
if I just ask you to characterize the elephant, um, how would you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not, I mean, it's probably a little bit like the seven wise men who kind of touch the elephant from different aspects. So I would probably also see it this way. And it also just dawned upon me step by step what we are kind of not looking at in your research. And maybe I can take you through in this way through the elephant. And maybe I just start with something which you might know as well, and which other people who are listening here might know as well. I mean, I have been teaching positive HR for 15 years. I've been doing all this research. I did board talks where I told them stop with this type of incentives or whatever. And I always had hard evidence, but it didn't really change so much.
Yeah.
And I then really had to ask myself why. I mean, what's going on here? We give our best evidence, and we do that in a very nice way and in a very convincing way, but nothing changes. And then, of course, so the first insight with this elephant is we are in a given system, and whatever we do will probably be twisted to some degree in this given system. So I think it's important to understand in what system we are in. And I mean, in what system am I in with trust talks? And I'm still giving keynotes on trust. Is again, I'm sorry, I'm still doing that. I'm still saying it pays. It makes me even more creative. They are more likely to go the extra mile, and so on and so forth. But now I realize something that Karen Leggett told me a very long time ago. So she's a famous critical management HR scholar. She told me that she believes all psychologists are slave to power. Now that sounds harsh, but I mean that's kind of what I did, and that's probably also what we did do in other areas. I mean, maybe not so much in positive organizational scholarship, but now I'm being mean. I'm guessing some positive psychologists are also on the call. But I mean, we all have to be a little bit wary. Don't we just pimp people so that they can work even harder?
Mm-hmm.
Or even we could do it differently. They used to say, happy cows give more milk. are we not kind of running into that trouble? So that was the one, or the first part of the elephant. I already found quite,
Yeah.
just to be more cognizant what's going on. That was the first thing I found important. Now
Yeah.
you have
So
to stop me because otherwise I'm talking too much.
no, this is the reason we invited you to be with us today. Please, please, keep talking with me. Um, the um, the this for me, I'll just share. I don't know if it shows up this way for you, but the this part of the elephant sometimes shows up for me as a compassion researcher and someone who does a lot of compassion talks,
Mm,
right? Um, to be uh, this was more true before the pandemic, but still, of course, true. Uh, that the advice that I would always be given as a speaker was to make sure that I make the business case for compassion. And often, what that meant to the person who might be giving me very well meaning advice was actually to make the case that you're saying that we're entrained to in some way, right? That happy cows make more milk kind of argument, and that the well-meaning advice givers who want us academic visitors into the hard-nosed world of business to have some impact will often advise us to make the case that you're actually telling us, I think, is not the case we want to be making, or that there's danger in making that case as a means of making ourselves relevant. So how do you talk about um, an alternative language and logic and rhetoric and way of thinking about this?
well, I mean, that is, I mean, one reason why I do good organizations. I now really try to say why this is sometimes also responsibility. And so I'm really changing the talk. I'm not saying this is a business case, but I'm really trying to say some aspects, maybe not trust, because I think trust is more it depends a little bit, as I tried to elaborate before. But if we maybe later talk about flourishing, I mean, I think this is a good in itself, and it shouldn't be corrupted by us always kind of. Also, by the way, of course, in academia, I mean, have you ever started a paper without first, in the first paragraph, writing how important that I mean, you did maybe with compassion, but all others probably always start with it's important. I mean, you also make the business case in our academic
Sure,
papers. So
sure.
in that
But we
sense,
don't want to be irrelevant, right? So well, I
yeah,
can imagine if we have some skeptical audience members who are saying, I have a good stake in this. Like, I want to be one of the people working with you to try to create a good organization, but I have to care, right? Don't I have to care about excellence or performance or other, outcomes? And
yeah, I mean, maybe when we later go into the project, I can explain that a little bit better. But yes, I believe it shouldn't make you bankrupt, because then it's not very helpful. If you're a good organization but out of business in a year, then you're not going to make the world any better. So in that sense, of course, prosperity is still a goal, but I think it shouldn't have the primacy. That's what I'm
yeah,
trying to say right now. Um, and I think you can make a very good case if you look into the world today that it shouldn't be the primacy anywhere any longer, because I think we managed to leave the world in a certain state where I think we don't want to leave it. Let's
yeah,
put it this way.
right,
So, but
right.
that's, of course, that's already a very strong normative case. If in my normal teaching, for instance, I just make sure that I say, well, this is, of course, you can always make this instrumental argumentation, but it's also a humanistic claim. And it's very important that you have that humanistic claim in mind as well. So I'm trying to do this
Mm,
bridging.
yeah,
Um,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's difficult. But already being more conscious about that, I think that's a first step. Really understanding that we are often lending hand to things we might not want to lend. And maybe the other thing is, and that's why I said it's maybe more of a problem for positive psychology. I think it makes already a change if you are saying, but if you take that seriously, and even if it's good for the business in the end, you also have to change your structures. You have to change the system as well. And I think that's a little bit how I understood the difference between organizational scholarship and maybe psychology, because in the first case, you try to also say we need to change the system. Like I loved your going to accounting departments or finance department and tell them think compassion. And that of course makes it also less likely that it's just instrumentalized. So I mean, really make sure that the system is also imbuing different aspects than just the business case. And I think that's one step you can also do if you don't want to go like I mean, because the second thing I'm saying about the elephant is really that I believe now, and I think this is even discussed very thoroughly in natural science, it's very hard to uphold an ideal of value-free science. I
Yeah.
think it's just not value free. It's not value free by the way we choose our topics. I mean, why did you choose compassion? Probably not because you find it very bad concept or something like that. It's probably also a value you have in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then also, of course, if we interact with practice, the moment we do anything with practice, it becomes central that there is something. I mean, we might say it's descriptive, but in reality, it's never only descriptive what we're doing. And then it goes further. It's also within science. Um, for instance, what research design are we choosing, or how do we conceptualize something? But there are so many things where values will flow in. Some call it biases, but I think it's not a bias, it's a value. But of course, if we do that, it then has also consequences how we have to work with that in a more conscious fashion. But I really have to say, I think value is in science, and it's better to be clear about that. And if you just go back for a second, what I was doing, it's good for performance. Um, Everybody wants to have it in their journals that we write about performance. I mean, yeah, you could say we are then in a neoliberal paradigm, which is are not reflecting about that. So just to say that I think we always are in some with values around, and we're working in values, and we have to understand the values we're working with.
Yeah. So that takes us to what I called your passion project, right? So we're um, coming to a different stance in relation to your own work, in relation to the field that we sit in, and then also um, wanting to enter into the work in a different kind of way. So tell us about good organizations, what you're doing, what you're aspiring to, how it's working out.
Yeah. Okay, how it's working out. Just say it's bloody complicated. It takes a very long
You
time.
didn't take on a tiny little aspiration here, so
No, I'm
I
going to.
can imagine some struggle is involved.
Yeah, I mean, what I said is you have to be conscious of your values, and you also have to inspect your values if you are realizing that's something you're doing. And good organizations is all about that. So, I mean, we started the Good Organizations project um, because I wanted to have organizations as flourishing enablers and not as suffering machines. And already saying that is, of course, a value statement. I mean, everything
Yeah.
else would be ridiculous to see it differently. And so, and but I'm not going to do the theory first. We then decided to really have also a normative theory in the background. So we're working with virtue ethics because that at the time seemed to be most fitting for what we're doing. So what is a good organization, and why find I that still very inspiring, and why is it so complicated? I think there's three things which make an organization a good organization. So first of all, it's um, enabling the humans who are working in this organization. You said to have meaningful work. I say maybe a little bit more in almost a, I don't know, normative language. So I say a good life at work.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I read that we are working 85,000 hours in our life.
At least.
So we're probably working more.
You're working a lot
Nerds,
more than
nerds
that.
I'm working more, so nerds are working more. But of course, I have a meaningful job, and I'm very grateful for that. But I mean, if we then take on board, and I think that's also what your research is showing, also from the whole center, that what we're doing every day is shaping us, then it should be something good that we're doing every day. So I think this is a very basic thing. What is the type of work? Is it good work we are having in these organizations? Then the next thing I already told you, I always find it important that this is kind of glued into the organization. So we're also looking at good practices and good interactions. So it's important to, I mean, that's what an organization is all about. It can enable these spaces where we can come better together. So co-elevate, co-create. So the holding aspect, which I think is very much also what is done in positive organizational scholarship. And then, but it's not only the holding, it's also the holding each other accountable. So it's also this responsibility that we're carrying together, which I believe is something which we can enable if we do practices in a different way. And then the third thing is that we also believe that the organization itself should be a good actor, probably a political actor, in the sense that I say something a little bit easily. I find organizations should enable the flourishing of all whom they touch. And
Yes,
that's
I
going beyond
love
CSR,
that.
let's put it this way.
Yes. No,
So that's what we are working on right now.
yes. As I said, no small aspiration there to create organizations that enable the flourishing of all that they touch.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. And it's harder than it sounds,
Yeah.
maybe. So, where have you seen the most success so far?
Well, I think I mean, it's very hard to say we have been successful already. I think it's a very nice narrative. Narrative is already very important to have that. But of course, we try to operationalize it. That's a little bit the difference from, I mean, I'm not a business ethics scholar, I'm not a moral philosopher, but we really try to operationalize this. And that's really not so easy. And here, the other aspect of the project comes in, that we say we also can't do that on our own. We need to do that with companies. So this is also a piece of engaged scholarship. So I do that together with a practice partner who used to be Chief Transformation Officer of ING. So he's bringing in, of course, a completely different view. And we're doing things like, for instance, we have been starting the so-called G labs, good labs, where we are trying to, if we find a practice where we believe this is going to enable some of the synergetic effects we were talking about, we're trying to try that out with companies and find out together how that functions. So it's a typical, in academia, we would call it very dryly an intervention study. But of course, it's a field experiment, and you know how messy that is. And it's really also about learning. Or maybe another thing which we have started, and it's now much more operative, is we started the Good Leadership Society, where we said we need to teach, to learn together, to share experiences. And we need to create a holding environment, but also this holding each other accountable for leaders. In organizations, but hopefully also at one stage political leaders. So you hear that's all a little bit more activist. There is, of course, research in there, but it's at the moment we're more about creating the platform to do more research, to bring practitioners in, and of course to also bring other researchers in order to bring that a step forward. So the book is still not written. We do have several PhD projects, but I also have to say these PhD projects is of course also not easy because we try to always operationalize very hairy constructs. So how do you operationalize flourishing as a neo Aristotelian virtue ethics guy would do it? Or how do you try to operationalize practical wisdom? I mean, a lot of things we are fighting our teeth out right now and trying to make it a little bit smaller to then really work with it.
Yeah. So we have a lot of listeners who are working in some way in the same direction that you're working. And when you think about how engaged scholarship encounters kind of what we might think of as engaged practice like this, what
Yeah.
are some ways that you found the two work together the best? So what are the lessons you're learning there?
Well, first of all, I find it really difficult. I have to admit, and we're really trying out first what are the better templates to do that. And it's difficult, of course, because it's not only a language problem, but you have to make sure that the researchers in the project still can do some publications at some stage. And you have to make sure that it's really a relevant problem for practice. And that is not so easy to bring it together. That's why we try, for instance, to work with something like this G Labs or maybe another project. And by the way, if somebody wants to join it, just please hook up with me on LinkedIn. We have now a group of HR practice people mainly and coaches where we are looking at how would we change people performance management in order to enable flourishing. And here we really try out what can we learn from each other, in which companies can we experiment, and it's a very exciting journey, but we're at the beginning. So I cannot give you already the biggest tips how to do it. The only thing I can tell you is that we tried for some time now already, and we've learned what doesn't work, but we haven't yet completely found out what works.
Think more about what doesn't work. What have you learned there?
Yeah, for instance, we thought at one stage it would be interesting to, I mean, there are a lot of reflexive practitioners out there who are really very philosophical and understand problems in a very deep way. So we were kind of thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to bring these people together? Because if each of them has some key for the whole puzzle and we could puzzle the things together. But then we had to find out, and we called these free thinkers, and that should have told us something. So we just found out how difficult that is, that people are really willing to listen to somebody else and to kind of let go a little bit of their understanding and to understand a little bit more of what the other person is saying.
Mm.
And
The free thinkers are wedded to their own ideas.
exactly. I mean, a little bit like researchers. We're not so much better, so I can sympathize. But I mean, it still is, I find that such a waste because we all understand that we need to change things. And of course, we're moraling people behind this good work idea. But even here, you have a lot of people interested, but it's so hard for them to really come together and to really make that a common mission and to define collective action.
Yeah.
So that's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
and one of the insights we had from that was that now one of my PhDs, she's looking at moral movements within organizations and is trying to find out exactly that. What does it take that a moral movement within an organization can spread and can have this common mission together? So because it's apparently not very easy if you try it out yourself.
Yeah. So when you, if we just turn to the world of HR practice as one world of practice among many that we could choose in an organization, but I have heard you interviewed about HR practices and this encouragement that makes sense to me and makes sense in relation to your research, that the way that HR practitioners could start thinking about good practice is to start questioning control, and HR practices of control.
Yeah.
That feels to me like an interesting place to dive in a little deeper to what you're learning and how you're stimulating that conversation, because it feels like you're going to the heart of what HR practices actually do.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, yes, and in HR, I call it performance management, but that's really, of course, if you do it in a traditional fashion, that's a controlling practice, or a lot of controlling practices, because you define what people have to do, you give them some appraisal on the way, which you call feedback. Then you start to look at the end, performance appraisal, and then you reward them accordingly. And that, of course, is almost like Taylorism. So it can be very controlling, and it doesn't leave a lot of creativity or latitude or cooperation on the side of employees. And so we did, for instance, an HR performance management research project, which goes already much more into that direction, where we looked at how would it be, and I mean, that sounds like it should be there everywhere, but of course it's not. How would it be if goals would be discussed? How would it even be if you would say you don't have these type of smart goals all the time, but sometimes you just have big goals? How's that called in your house? Everest goals. But
Everett goals,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. But nothing else but project goes on top. So you have people doing their contribution, and the team does their contribution to the Everest goal, but you don't do this small, you have to do this, you have to do this, and at the end of the year or after 3 months. Um, we were also looking at, I mean, that's done now all over the place. Could you do feedback differently? I think that's the one thing that most companies embraced. They now do, as they call it, meaningful conversations, um, which of course is already nice if they start talking to each other, but it's also a little bit like you would think they should do that for a long time already. So you can go to each of these practices. Performance appraisal, maybe we do that, maybe that's interesting for the hearers. I mean, performance appraisal, very nice articles, even in our journals out there. Most scholars now say that's really something which is not, which we shouldn't do, because we cannot measure things the way we pretend to measure it. Plus, these performance appraisals are not really positive for organizational performance. So why do we do that and torture every manager with it? And of course, I would say let's go back to a salary system, much more easier. Forget about all these incentives; they're having too many side effects anyhow. So I mean, you can go to all these practices and always think how would they look in a more enabling manner, in a more humanistic manner, and try to do it this way. But of course, the problem is a little bit, and I think that's why it's not enough, um, that you have some givens. Like they all believe we need to have bonuses, um,
Mm-hmm.
mainly because CEOs have such large bonuses. And if CEOs have bonuses, you cannot get rid of bonuses in the system. Now, if you have bonuses, you also need to have performance evaluation. And you kind of have all these systematic aspects which you're still having. Even if you know these are nice and better practices, even if most HR people would say these are interesting practices, they also don't address the elephants in the room, if you want to put it this way.
Yes.
And so I believe in that case, what you would have to do is you would have to um, address the role HR people play. And so you have to address the role-based leadership, and would have to see, well, maybe we have to become a little bit more courageous. Maybe we have to really become a little bit more questioning and doing more inquiries in organizations in order to have a higher chance to go towards that. So that's the next step to take. Hopefully, I wasn't going too all over the place.
No, not at all. It's leading me back to some old shoes that I've worn in the past where we talked about, uh, you and I have had conversations about how how do we structure in more possibility for courageous collective organizing and
Yeah.
courageous collective action, where you're asking people to rethink fundamentally the roots of their practice and experiment in a much bigger way than tinkering around the edges of their performance systems.
Yeah.
And that will require um, stepping into what I think virtue ethicists would talk about as courage.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love your work on courage. Yeah, I can remember we had a very nice conversation about that. And yet, even here, I would go a step further and say, in order for this to take hold, we also need to create more spaces in organizations. So we need to take a little bit of the work intensification out. We need to take a little bit of the action bias out. Um, and we also have to encourage all of us together in order to get a little bit more morally courageous. I mean, you looked at that, but I think that, that is also one of the ideas why we say it needs maybe something like a leadership society, that leaders across organizations could create some holding so that they muster more courage to go there. So I think we just have to think about different leeways to make that more possible.
Yes. Well, in the work on compassion and organizations, when we studied organizations that were trying to be involved in the changing the use of conflict minerals, for instance, there's uh, something about compassion there. There's something about the courage to really change a broad set of organizational and societal practices. And it required a number of people in a number of influential organizational seats to agree together to approach it,
Yeah,
because any one of those leaders on their own would have either been inefficacious because they wouldn't make enough change in the system, or it would have been too risky and their shareholders would have cut
yeah.
them off.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And I think there are two things here. The one is maybe a reading tip, which is not so the usual reading tip. There is a very nice a political philosopher. She's called Lisa Herzog, and she's written about reclaiming the system. And she's talking about collective responsibility. And that collective responsibility would be also that you have different leaders from different organizations of the same sector, for instance, trying to make the conditions in the sector more conducive that these type of behaviors are possible. And I think that's one thing. It's a very nice idea, which I believe is very important. And the second thing I've probably now forgotten, but that was the more important one. It comes back later. Yeah, no, that's gone now. But anyway,
But
we'll see.
because we're making you work so hard in this conversation. But so as good organizations have gotten traction on these, your three uh, tenets of good organization. Um, uh, when you think about organizations having responsibility
Yeah,
beyond the organization
yeah,
itself, I know that that you've been thinking about convening conversations or involving organizations that dialogue in new ways. So, um, how are you how are you invoking that dialogue in your work?
yeah, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Good that you reminded me. I mean, one way to say is also that we need to understand a little bit better how we can make it easier in our economies, that companies such as Patagonia or other companies are really trying to behave decent or even more, really trying to behave good, that they can survive in our economy and are not outcompeted by those who just pretend to be like that. So
Yeah.
and that's why we are currently also hosting a talk. And for me, that's one of the most interesting one because I learned so much. I really didn't know anything of that. It's called Business for Humanity, where we're looking at alternative economic systems. So, for instance, we are going to have a speaker on Buddhist economics. We are talking with somebody on well-being economics. Of course, we're also going towards degrowth, care, I mean, feminist economics, you name it. And I just believe just already knowing that there are alternatives and not all of them are like extremely away from the type of economy we have right now. So, I mean, degrowth is quite, that's often almost a socialist movement, but you have like also things which are a little bit closer to what we're doing. And I just find it already important to understand what's out there, to be a little bit more informed when we are seeking to reform things in our state, in our city. I mean, some of these initiatives are really community initiatives. It's just very interesting to learn more about that, and that's what we're doing right now. And we're offering that. It's always free as an initiative for people to also find out. And I just have to tell you one thing, which I find almost a little bit sad, but it's also for our students. And I'm in a business schools with a large economic department, because apparently we're still teaching in economics mainly neoclassical economics, so they don't really know about alternative economic systems. And I think that's just one way as well where we can make it for companies a little bit easier if we understand what we can do.
Yes. So if we were preparing the ground a little bit better
Yeah.
with business graduates prepared to have the conversation in a different kind of way, we as business schools, as a community of business schools, would be preparing members of these organizations to have a different approach to the work, but also to enter into the collaborative dialogue.
Well, yes, and I believe we will need our creativity in what way whatsoever to find out how we can make sure that our grandchildren still have a happy, nice life to live on this planet. So I think there are things we have to go at, and then these are the ways what we can contribute as academia. I mean, teaching is always, or education is always something we can do. And I'm just such a curious person. For me, it's also very interesting. So I'm really looking forward to Julie Norton, who is talking about feminist economics. Well, how do you scale care ethics for the world? That's very interesting, very amazing.
Well, we have been taking our conversation lofty, but I wonder if we could come back to a
Yeah.
a topic that can be probably very pragmatic for some of our listeners, and that is the topic of well-being. So I'm wrestling with this topic right now, and I want to learn from you. You wrote to me in one of our preparations for this that you think of the word well-being as already, I can't remember your exact phrase, but already normative, right?
Yeah.
Like it's already carrying the positive for whom, positive in what way
Yeah.
question, right within the term.
Yeah.
And it's such a term of trend right now, at least in the US business community. And it's a ripe term for us to examine with more care in the way that you're inviting us to do with all of our practice work. So would you talk with me about what you mean when you say it's already normative and how you're holding it?
Yeah, well, I mean, remember, I told you that I believe not only by the choice of topics, but also how we do our research design, how we conceptualize that these are all already value-driven choices. And if you look at well-being, then let's just look at the big three ways to look at it. It can be life satisfaction, it can be hedonic, which is a little bit about more the good feelings, so the psychological well-being, or it can be eudaimonic well-being, which is closer to thriving and flourishing or the good life. And I think already by this, you see, this is a very, and we don't do that very cognizant always, but that's already a choice. That's already a value choice.
Mm. Mhm.
And maybe if we then go a little bit more into what I personally, of course, from where I come from, is find more interesting. So it's flourishing, it's thriving. Um, as I said, this is eudaimonic. And maybe just let me give you the definition of eudaimonic. I love it. This is following your demon, your inner spirit, and your essence. So I mean, that's already very nice. But anyway, okay, I get carried away. Um, then we can see this is about human positive functioning. So what does this mean? Because there is certainly not a clear scientific way to say what is a human positive functioning. It's about what is a good life. Again, we have the word good in it. If we have a word like good in it, we need to make clearer what we mean with good. So I think here it would be really helpful to understand it better. Just that we measure the right things, that we conceptualize it in the right way, not in a topsy-turvy fashion. Because if we leave out most important things, um, it could go into the wrong direction. So, I mean, again, remember human relations telling us be nice to people, then they work more. So then we would be only the happy cows give more milk direction. I think that's not what we want. So I think making this clearer, what would belong to anything like flourishing, that I think would be important. And that is, we need to go back to theory. I read a very nice article by Blaine Fowers, who looked at the 8 most often and most important used flourishing and thriving scales. And his verdict was quite clear. Only one of them had a theoretical derivation. All the others were kind of, yeah, we do it a little bit like this or a little bit like that. They didn't really explain it clearly. And then, of course, you can see that you might leave out important things for the good life, which would be such a shame because then it wouldn't be a good life. So, kind of really going back, what would it mean? Why do we have certain aspects in there or not? And then he also says it's a hodgepodge. So in reality, there's not so much overlap as we think, because and then we know that from we do that as well, or I do that as well. We pick a little bit and we tweak it a little bit, and in the end, it's not the same. We call it the same, but it's a completely different thing. And he says that's a shame. Shouldn't we really try to find out first theoretically and then also measure it away, what is the good life? And then maybe also the next question he finds very important, if we have something like that, we maybe also want to question ourselves, is that just a good life for a North Atlantic person? Or is that also the good life for an Ubuntu or somebody in China or Japan? So he's also saying we need to inspect the cultural aspect here a little bit more clear. Now, I don't know whether that was crunchy enough. I didn't really give you yet my definition, but maybe that's also not so interesting. So I'm just saying, I think it's very important here to acknowledge that there are normative theories out there we could consult. We could try to find out better what values are we having in here, why these, so justify what we're doing, and then do what we can do best, create good scales and measure it.
Yes. I this is one of the reasons I was eager to be able to talk with you and to have you talk with our audience, because I do think one of the benefits of bringing scholarly work to questions like this is the discipline of thinking this way, the capacity to turn to theory, the training to understand measures in fine-grained fashion and look at them through this lens. And I um, I often see this. I'm curious, and so I'm watching this dialogue that we're having in the way we're talking play out in the world of social media posts and popular media articles, right? And I think so. One one thing that I've seen just recently is that after several years in the recovery from pandemic and figuring out how to come to terms with the um, pandemic ongoing life, um, the work of well-being has often been boiled down to take care of yourself,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
put even more uh, individualistically and selfishly, take care of yourself first.
Yeah.
Right. And I finally see a little bit of questioning in the popular discussion of this. Like, is taking care of yourself first really well-being?
Yeah.
And that I I think without this kind of rigorous, theoretically informed discussion and turning back to places where we can draw on larger concepts to help us,
Yeah.
these things could collapse in ways that become really unhelpful.
Yeah. No, I'm completely agreeing. I mean, you can see that this is maybe even a little bit US centric. So all these measures are rather individualistic, and also I would say freedom above all measures. And that's all fine and good. But if you, for instance, went back to Aristotle, it was clear that you would have much more, so man are a social animal. So you would have relationships priced much higher. You would have a common good coming into. So, I mean, then you see it's the good life also has something to do with some moral development.
Yeah.
I think just seeing that there are these different aspects and also reflecting maybe what we need now in our country. So Switzerland is very similar. We also are individualistic, maybe even a little bit libertarian. Maybe in our countries, what we need right now is bridges and finding a way back also to bring in community. And I mean, this is it's not really it's not really a political statement, but it's also something to learn. What do we need as humans to lead this good life? And here a little bit broader, I think, would be helpful. Otherwise, we're stuck in what we are thinking right now at this stage, and we know already it's a little bit dysfunctional. That's the only thing which will help us.
Yeah. Well, Antoinette, you started out at the beginning saying that you felt like you were a cousin to positive organizational scholarship. So I don't want to undermine that, but I want to at least insist that it's a first cousin, like close
Yes.
relationship.
So I'm now getting second cousin or something like that. But that's nice.
Our time together, and I bring you much closer into the family tree here. How might we work together as engaged scholars and engaged practitioners to really join hands in advancing the work that you're doing?
Well, please come and look what we're doing. Visit our webcasts we have, listening to the beautiful talk we had with Monica and Jane. That's still a highlight. And I mean, there will be also, we are starting this movement. And so if you're interested, please just reach out. We're very open for everybody who's interested. Let's put it this way.
All right. Well, we will make sure
Yeah.
when we share the video and other resources that we share, ways to be in touch with you. And we hope you will come back and be with us in all kinds of ways, and that we continue to learn from each other. Thank you so much
Thank
for a
you.
wide-ranging conversation today. I appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you. And the same to you, as you know. I mean, great fan. Courage and compassion. What's better than that?
And thank you to everyone watching and listening. Bye-bye.